Eurorack is full to overflowing with weird modules that can be difficult to figure out. But this one, and just the idea of a PLL in general, really had me scratching my head. I knew PLL meant phase-locked loop, but what does that mean? What loop? Why would I want to lock its phase? And why does the term show up on early 80s hi-fi receivers? That last one was maybe answered by my previous video about the over-the-radio effect, but the larger explanation took me in directions I never expected. So let's dig into just what this acronym is up to. Hi everyone, I'm Jeff. Welcome back to Sound and Voltage. If you're interested in modular synthesis, sound design, math, or weird circuits, this might be the channel for you. I don't monetize the channel, I don't take sponsors, so if you end up enjoying the video, maybe hit like and subscribe. Also, I put out some music last year on the NES 318 label. And if you like that sort of music I have in the background, maybe check it out. There's a link in the description. Okay, let's get down to it. This is going to be a longer video, so here's a quick itinerary for us. I'm going to start just by talking about what a PLL is in general. Then I'm going to introduce the Doepfer module and talk through the three main components of it. I want to spend some time talking about how things actually work under the covers. And from there I'll explain how the over-the-radio effect I demonstrated in the last video works. Then I'll show you how to make a PLL of your own, no specialized module required. Then I'll demonstrate one of the main uses for the PLL out in the world. And finally, there's going to be a lot of yummy beep-bloop weirdness. It's been 2 months now, on and off, that I've been pondering the mysteries of the phased-locked loop, and it took me an embarrassingly long time to internalize just what it is that it does. So I'm going to save you that time and jump straight to it. A PLL is an oscillator follower. It has its own internal oscillator, and when you patch in a different VCO from somewhere in your rack, the internal oscillator, the one inside the PLL, will start running at the same speed as that external oscillator. A quick demo is going to really help bring that idea home. I have the PLL here, and I'm taking the internal oscillator output and running it to the Mordax. You can see that it's running around 390 Hz. Then I've got the nonlinear circuit's Kirishou? Yeah, the oscillator here doing its own thing. You can see that it's running much faster. So now I'm going to take that output and run it into the signal input on the PLL, and yeah, there you go. The VCO in the PLL suddenly jumped to match what was coming in from the Kirishou, and it happened super fast. Now I'm turning down the frequency on the Kirishou, and the one inside the PLL is remaining right there in step. That's pretty crazy, right? How can this detect the frequency of another signal and then generate the exact same frequency itself? This is a really simple module. There's just a couple of chips in there. None of them are capable of any real calculation, but somehow it's managing it, and quite handily at that. But how? I started looking at PLLs mostly just out of modular-driven curiosity. There aren't too many PLL-based modules and fewer that directly expose that PLL to exploration. So when the mystery became too much for me, I broke down and bought this one, the Doepfer A-196. Surely, I thought to myself, surely the manual is going to tell me how to use it. Well, I joke. The manual does have some descriptions and some ideas, but it's the kind of thing that makes a lot more sense once you know how it works in the first place, and thus this video. One thing for sure, the front panel did not do me any favors. I mean, yes, it does clearly indicate that there are three components to the thing. Internal VCO at the top, a phase comparator in the middle, and the filter at the bottom. We know that the PLL is going to follow an external oscillator, match its frequencies, but how do these three components do that? One thing I breezed by really fast when I was looking at the module's ICs, this one here in particular, it is the PLL. Most of the magic is on this chip, and the module itself is just sort of an interface into that IC. It can be easily spotted here by the identifier, CD74HC4046A, rolls off the tongue. But looking at the logic diagram now, there isn't anything too tricky going on in there. It's mostly just logic and op amps, certainly nothing that can somehow compute and reproduce the frequency of the incoming waveform. If we compare the logic diagram with the front panel on the A196, we have the top section, it's the VCO, and you can see it here on the logic diagram, we've got a VCO. Next on the module is the phase comparator section where the two oscillator outputs are compared. There's a switch to pick between the three options, and here in the diagram we can see PC1, PC2, and PC3 outputs. Lastly, on the module, we've got this low-pass filter, but it doesn't seem to be on this diagram. Well, except, wait, what's this down here? It looks like just a resistor and a capacitor, and it is, but, and does this ever need a video of its own because it was blowing my mind, a resistor and a capacitor is all you need to create a simple filter. I mean, it's not going to be some lush resonant filter that you want to put in your audio path, but as a first order filter to cut high frequencies, this is all it takes. So that filter, such as it is outside the boundary of the PLL, meaning it's the module's job to add that, but everything else that makes up the PLL is on that chip. So let's follow the output after it leaves the filter. It seems to go around and yeah, it's fed back into the chip and goes through this op amp and then into the VCO input, the one that controls the speed of the oscillator. That's weird. But yeah, look at the Doepfer front panel. It's a little hidden here, but at the very edge of the panel, there's a line that indicates the filter is going back up to the VCO input. So let's sketch this up. Out here, we've got the external oscillator. That's the one we want the PLL to follow. Inside the box, let's put another VCO for the PLL's internal oscillator. Both of those are fed into a phase comparator, and the result is routed back around through the filter and fed back into the internal VCO input. This is the loop we mean when we talk about a phased locked loop. And this little filter, that's the loop filter. But what is the filter doing here at all? Now is maybe a good time to drop something else on you. Remember when I said that a resistor and a capacitor were enough to make a filter? Well, they're also enough to make a slew limiter, which is just a way of slowing down the change between voltage levels. In fact, at this level, they're the same thing. A filter is a slew limiter and vice versa. Mathematically, they're the same thing. The only real difference is a matter of time scale. And this needs its own video. It's killing me not to go into it right now, but it's a big detour and I'll save it for another time. For now, it's enough to know that the loop filter here is acting as a slew limiter, which just smooths out whatever's coming out of the phase comparator. Then that smoothed output, the control voltage, let's call it what it is fed back in to tweak the speed of the internal oscillator. It's a feedback loop, where the phases of the two oscillators are used to create a sort of error term that measures how far apart the oscillators are, and then uses that measurement to adjust the speed of the internal oscillator. It's worth calling out here that the A-196 has a switch for different VCO rates. This just controls the range over which the PLL will best lock against the external oscillator. I'll be playing with it a little later on, but most of the time I just leave it on low or mid. So why are we talking about phase locking and not frequency locking? This is the part that's most frustrating not to get into, but I tried to include it and it added like 5 minutes to the video, and it doesn't honestly add that much, but maybe this can help. The term phase just refers to where we are in those circles off to the left. I've got two oscillators here, the internal VCO going quite fast, and the one for the PLL starting quite slow. Their circles are just there to really illustrate how the phase is changing, and at much different rates between the two. The external oscillator is easily lapping the one on the PLL. The rate that the phase is changing is one way you can define the frequency of a signal. But now the PLL is speeding up, and you can see that the rate of change of the phase is increasing as it does, spinning faster. Now let's look at them together and notice how, when we get to a matching speed, the phases of the two oscillators are a constant distance apart. This is what it means to be phase locked. They're not at the exact same phase at the same time, but the distance between those phases is constant, and that means they have the same frequency. Now from here, we'd have to look at how the different phase comparators work to understand how it makes that determination and what it outputs. That's too much for right now, but I hope this explains why we're talking about phase at all. And there are 2 or 3 obvious places we can take output from this PLL. We'll start with the one I looked at in my previous video. The gist of it is this. A PLL can demodulate a signal that's been frequency modulated. Let's say on this side, we've got a really fast oscillator to act as a carrier. Say it's running at 100 kilohertz. And then we've got a song or whatever it is we want to put on the radio. We run that through the FM input. The resulting output is mostly right around that 100 kilohertz carrier, but it's going to vary a little slower, a little faster as the carrier is nudged about by the frequency and amplitude of the song. On the other side, we have the PLL, and we know what that does now. It tries to lock onto the incoming signal. And because the carrier frequency is stronger than just the little variations, the PLL locks onto it, running at 100 kilohertz as you'd expect. But remember when I said that the output of the phase comparator is sort of an error term? That's the trick here. The incoming signal is mostly at that same frequency, but there are little variations in that frequency, and the phase comparator outputs whatever little nudges it needs to push the frequency back to a stable 100 kilohertz. Those little nudges to push the received signal back down to the carrier frequency are the exact opposite of the little nudges that were applied to the carrier to get the modulated signal. The PLL literally undoes what the FM modulation did. That error term, those little nudges, that demodulated signal, they're all the same thing, Now's maybe a good time to mention the 3 different phase comparators we can choose between. Number 2 performs the best, and the little red LED, that indicates whether or not number 2 is locked against the carrier. Even if you're using phase comparator number 1, which I'm going to be doing here, if the little light is on, that means phase comparator 2 says you're at the same frequency. Like I said, I use number 1, which ends up being a simple logical XOR gate of the 2 inputs. It can be noisy as hell, but it's awesome. Number 2 is this interesting flip-flop circuit, and number 3 is apparently a mystery. But let's stick with number 1 right now, the XOR, because it makes it really easy for us to build out our own PLL without a specialized chip. Let's set up a test bench of sorts. On the transmit side, I've got the radio music playing some music. That's what I want to broadcast. I'm using oscillator number 1 on the Doepfer Quad VCO as the carrier, and so I'm modulating it with the music coming out of radio music. On the receiving side, I'm going to build a phase lock loop out of other modules. For the internal VCO, I'm just going to use oscillator number 2 on the Doepfer. For the XOR logic, I've got the nonlinear circuits bools here. And for the filter, I've got one of the earliest modules I ever built, the noise reap filter. The dedicated Doepfer PLL module, it could make for a much cleaner signal, using its second phase comparator especially, but clean isn't what we're going for here. Also, the thing about having a real filter in the mix is we get control of resonance, which can have some really interesting effects. Now remember what I said about filters and slew limiters being the same thing? I just finished building Mid-Century Modular's 3x slew and dropped it in. The tricky part, and the main difference between a filter and a slew limiter, is speed. Filters that work against audio rate signals obviously have to have really fast slew times. If the audio is 1 kHz, for instance, the slew time needs to be well south of 1 millisecond, and probably more like on the order of tens of microseconds. That's not what something like 3x slews here is designed for. Even still, it's got some fun potential and worth playing with. And then, just for fun, let's get everything out of the way other than just the XOR. This is the bare minimum of a PLL, and it's still usable, which I guess kind of makes my previous video about how to achieve the radio effect a little incomplete. I only just discovered this, though. It really is the simplest version of the effect, but there's no control over it, really. It's fun, though. But let's check out another use of the PLL. If you've been around modular for a while, you've probably come across a clock divider. It usually looks something like this, with a bunch of divisions indicated on it. Here's the Doepfer A-196, divisions on it of powers of 2, divided by 2, divided by 4, divided by 8, so on down to divided by 1024. What it does is take some sort of clocking signal, and then outputs 1 pulse for every 2 ticks of the clock, or every 4, or every 8, or up to every 1024 clock ticks. This is useful for a lot of reasons, but one neat trick you can do is send in a square wave oscillator. Clock dividers are typically fast enough to handle audio rates, so it's not a problem. But what do you think is going to happen if we patch in a 440 Hz tone as the clock, and then take the divided by 2 output? Well, the output's only going to pulse once for every 2 clock ticks. There are 440 clock ticks in a second, divided by 2, and there you have it. The output is 220 Hz. Try plugging it into the divided by 4 output. Now it's running at 440 divided by 4 equals 110 Hz. Clock dividers also equal frequency dividers. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do with this. I'll save that for another time. But for now, it's enough to know how they work. You hand it a square wave, and it gives you back square waves at some division of that original frequency. There are also clock multipliers, which do the opposite. Give it a clock, and it returns square wave that has a frequency of a multiple of the clock. But that's actually one of the common uses for a phased lock loop, to create a high frequency output from a low frequency one, and it uses a clock divider along the way. Here's the diagram we've been using so far. We're pretty familiar with this now. We have the external oscillator that the PLL is going to try to lock to, and then inside the PLL box, we've got the internal oscillator, the phase comparator, and the filter, and of course this shows the feedback loop, where the output of the phase comparator is being fed back into the oscillator to give the little nudges necessary to match frequency. But what happens here if we break this connection, and instead of sending the internal oscillator to the comparator directly, we'll pass it through the clock divider, and we'll take the divided by 2 output and run that into the phase comparator. Any ideas what's going to happen? Pause the video if you want to think about it. So the phase comparator's job is to look at the 2 incoming signals and figure out how much of a nudge the internal oscillator needs to match the external. But now the internal oscillator is, as far as the phase comparator can tell, running at half speed. It isn't really, it's going the same speed, but the clock divider means that the phase comparator is working against a square wave that's running half as fast. That means whatever nudge the comparator has to do originally, now it has to be twice as strong to make up that difference. Except the oscillator isn't really running at half speed, so it's getting a larger than normal nudge, and that has the effect of doubling the frequency. Quick demo, we've got the Cashew oscillator outputting a 55 Hz square wave. The Mordax is helpfully calling that A1. I'm just going to hook it up to the PLL normally, and you can see the PLL's internal oscillator snaps to 55 Hz. Great. That's just as we'd expect. The oscillator is normaled into the phase comparator, but we can break that connection. We'll take the direct output of the oscillator and run it to the clock divider, and take the divided by 2 output and run that into the phase comparator's input number 1. Internally, the oscillator's at some frequency, but the comparator doesn't see that. It sees the half-speed output from the divider. That means the phase comparator is going to have to give a bigger push to the frequency in order to get that to where it thinks it needs to go. And now, once the feedback loop settles, you can see that the output is registering 110 Hz. Neat. I'll change it to the divided by 4 output instead. Once again, takes a bit to settle, but once it does, it registers at 220 Hz. However, when I push it now to divided by 8, you'd expect to see the other side coming out at 440 Hz, but now it's not able to. That's because the internal oscillator has those 3 speeds, low, mid, and high, and until now I've been using low because the frequencies we're looking at are pretty low. But apparently, this is about where we need to move up to mid speed. I flip the switch, and now you can see it locking on 440 Hz. And going to the divided by 16 output, predictably, doubles the frequency again to 880. Something that I want to highlight here is how tight that doubling really is. We've gone up by a factor of 16, a jump of 4 octaves. But now look how close those 2 current frequencies are to their target A note. The external oscillator is sitting just a little high of 55 Hz of the A1, and the PLL's oscillator is sitting just a little high of A5. Okay, so let's take the output and give it a listen. As we step back down the divisions, the frequency halves. And here, when I go back to the divided by 2 input, we expect to see 110 Hz and a clear tone, and instead we get this great 80s video game sound effect. We had to step up from slow speed to mid on the way up, and now on the way back down, we need to go back to low. And when we do that, everything normalizes and we can hear and see it lock at 110 Hz. What I want to point out here, as opposed to the FM radio stuff earlier where we were taking the output of the phase comparator and sending it right to the mixer, now we're taking the internal oscillator as the output. We just want to hear the result of these little nudges, not the nudges themselves. I'm going to go back to the divided by 32 output, which should be leading us to 1760 Hz, but instead, I'm on the wrong speed again. And when I flip it back to mid, we can hear it slide down to that expected 1760. That process of trying to lock the internal oscillator against the external is where a lot of the noisy, glitchy fun lives. And that gets us back to those crazy noises at the start of the video. And now we're well and truly in the realm of Doepfer's original statement about this module being best explored through trial and error. But at least we know what the beast is trying to do now, and understanding something is the first step to breaking it. But it doesn't have to be all trial and error. We do have 2 specific techniques to lean on. We know that if the internal VCO is struggling to lock, that can create some great chirps and beeps and video game noises. And we have the FM demodulation trick. In addition to the radio thing, the comparator output can be a great source of industrial-ish sounds, especially when put through some reverb. Also, we saw how we can break the normalization between the three components, and by altering the signal path, like when we used a clock divider, we can do all sorts of crazy things. These are all great places to start exploring. But as you've probably already deduced, this is the sort of module where it's pretty hard to know in advance what you're going to get, so getting your hands dirty is really the only way to find the good stuff. Okay, I think that wraps up my look at the phase-locked loop finally. I never really anticipated going down this particular rabbit hole, but as is so often the case in modular, you don't always end up where you thought you were headed. Is there a technique or module or buzzword that has you confused? If so, drop a note in the comments. I'm always looking for new video ideas. I think next time I'm going to take my life in my hands and actually express an opinion on the internet and talk about why modular may or may not be right for a person. Well, I suppose if you got to this point in this video, there's a good chance that modular is really right for you. But there's always new folks coming into the hobby with a head full of weird ideas. And speaking of making it this far, if you're still watching, then I want to personally thank you. These videos can be a bear to make, and folks like you are the reason I put myself through the whole rigmarole. If you haven't yet subscribed, maybe now's the time to do that, but even if you don't, you're still awesome.